does the air conditioner compressor go? Well, on the LS series, it mounts right here. And I only died twice, just a little bit. Hello everyone, welcome back to Maverick Mods. On last week's episode, I basically got the rear end mounted in the car and squared to the car. The reason for doing that was I needed a solid beginning for being able to do what I'm about to do to the front suspension. You guys have probably seen hints of this. You've scratched your head and wondered just what the heck am I doing? All right, here's what I'm doing. The suspension setup for the original second gen F-body, in other words, the Firebird Camaro front suspension, gone. It's going away. Not going to use it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to adapt the engine cradle and front suspension from the 2000 Z28 that we got as a donor car and graft that in its place. All right, so I'm going to pause for a second. Everybody throw stones at me, howl at the moon, go right ahead, and let's get on. And let's talk about why I'm doing this, okay? And there's a couple of reasons for it. Why am I doing this? What on earth could it possibly, what kind of benefit is there to doing this? I tell you what, it's a lot of work to do it. No guarantee in the end that it's going to work, but we're going to give it a try anyway. Okay, so why? All right, well, as you all know, I'm LS swapping the car, okay? So first and foremost, I got to looking at just what it takes to do the LS swap on a second gen F-body, and it's really not that hard, okay? The only real difficulties are motor mounts, which tons of companies out there make kits for that. So motor mounts, not a problem. Generally, if you get an LS from a truck out of a junkyard, you need to put an F-body, a late model F-body oil pan as a substitute for the F-body itself. We have an LS1 out of a late model Camaro, so oil pan, not a problem, it fits. Okay, but this is where we run into some problems beyond here. So beyond just being physically able to fit the engine in the engine compartment or into the original subframe crossmember, that's where a lot of the conversions stop, and they kind of leave you in the dark as to what to do next with everything else. Okay, we all know the horror stories about doing an engine swap. Putting the engine in is the easy part. It's getting everything else to fit and everything else to work together. That's the hard part. So this is where I started with my thought process of integrating as much of the Z28 donor car as possible. And as the more I got to looking at it, trying to move over the engine cradle solved a lot of problems. So problem number one, motor mounts. Well, this is the Z28 cradle, and the LS1 is designed to go in here. So motor mounts, not a problem. Clearance with the oil pan, not a problem. Steering clearance, not a problem. All right, so first issue of actually making the engine fit by using the Z28 cradle, it automatically fits, okay? So let's go to the whiteboard again real quick, and I'm gonna list some other reasons as well. And I promise I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on the whiteboard today, just enough to get my point across, and then we'll start to actually bang it on the car. Okay, number one, engine fitment. Two options. A, original subframe. Original subframe requires modifications. Okay. Option B, Z28 cradle. It's made to fit, not a problem. Okay. While we're talking about the dropping the engine in and fitting everything, let's talk about something real quick that, frankly, a lot of guys, they're not going to install, so it's not an issue. For us, it's a big issue. Down here in the southeast, especially on the coast, air conditioning. Okay. All you guys out there saying you are a wimp. Dude, hang out right here on coastal South Carolina for a couple of months in the summer, especially this last month, and then come to me. I lived in Dubai for 5 years. I know heat, I know humidity. Sorry, this car is getting air conditioning. Okay, back to the board. Air conditioning, all right? So again, we go original subframe. Original subframe requires a ton of modifications. If we go with the Z28 cradle, everything fits. It's almost like it was designed to fit, which it was. Okay? All right, let's get away from the board for just a second, and I'll explain why that is. If we come down and we look at the donor engine here, first thing you notice is, where does the air conditioner compressor go? Well, on the LS series, it mounts right here, okay? And let me set the tripod up and I'll just loosely mount the compressor so you can see where it goes. Apologies for the external noise. Not a whole lot I can do about that right now. But basically, let me get the bracket in here real quick. Here. Oh, I think that's a 15, not a 13. Then the compressor itself. So why did I just mount this air conditioner compressor up? I'll show you. So with the compressor mounted in the factory location, you can kind of see the original Firebird subframe, okay, basically would come right about here. So for all intents and purposes, I know it's not quite that much, it would come right about here. And there's no way to keep the LS air conditioner compressor mounting location in the same location unless you relieve the subframe to allow for the compressor. That's doable. It opens up its own can of worms. The other issue that comes in is the LS motor mounts are farther back on the block than the earlier versions, which are about right here. Okay, well, obviously you're going to leave the LS mounts there because that's where they are. But the adapter plates that allow the LS to fit in the stock second gen F-body location interfere with the back of the compressor as well. So there are kits where you can relocate the air conditioner compressor. But in our case, if I use the Z28 cradle, I don't need a kit. I already have the air conditioner compressor mounted. Same thing with the belts and pulleys. If you move the air conditioner compressor, now you got to start thinking about where you're going to move everything else. So for this circumstance, we're right back to air conditioning, original subframe, too many modifications, using Z28 cradle, big check mark. Okay, let's move on to another issue that I benefit from by using the Z28 cradle. All right, have I bored the pants off of you yet? I hope not. If I have, well, stick with me. Okay, so we talked about the engine fitment. We talked about air conditioning, okay? Next up, this is related to the Z28 cradle and suspension in a way, and it won't make a whole lot of sense right now, but let's talk about brakes, okay? Well, by using the Z28 rear end, we automatically get rear disc brakes, which is good. I'm not a fan of drum brakes, just the way it is. So we've got rear discs with the Z28 rear end. But on the front end, okay, let's take a look at the difference between the brakes between the Camaro, or excuse me, the Firebird and the Z28. Sort of side by side here. Here's the setup from the original Firebird. We've got 11-inch rotors And this is just a factory, although, well, somebody painted them red. That's good for at least 50 feet better stopping distance. But what we essentially have is just factory stock single piston calipers. Okay, good for its day. This brake setup is fine for a stock application. I really wouldn't want to use this brake system if we were even up in the horsepower by any more than about 50 horsepower over stock. You really start finding the limitations in the stock brakes. So my benefit is I go from a single piston caliper, 11-inch rotors, and this is what we got with the Z28. Disregard the rust, I'll have that all cleaned off. But I've got 12-inch rotors, drilled and slotted, and I've got dual piston calipers. This is all factory, and it's a good upgrade from the second gen F-body brake system. The problem is there's no way to adapt this system easily to the original F-body spindles. There's a couple of guys out there that have kind of Frankensteined it, but nobody makes anything, nor could I fabricate anything that I would be happy with to put this onto the original spindle and suspension setup. So instead of spending multiple thousands of dollars on a Willwood or a Bear brake system that'll basically give me this, I've got this in the factory configuration. But to use that, I need to use the factory spindles, knuckles, and the factory hubs. So if I use the original brake system or the original system with the original brake setup, I've got to modify it. If I go with the Z28 brakes, it's all factory, it's all designed to work together. Okay. I've got two more things to talk about, and then we're done with the board. Okay, let's talk steering for just a second. All right. So what we have with the Z28 is I've got a factory rack and pinion system, okay? Designed to go in this cradle, designed to work with this suspension and these steering knuckles. Versus the original steering box, drag link, idler arm, tie rod ends, etc. Okay, is there any real benefit to this versus the original setup? Debatable, probably not, with the exception of simplicity. Okay, the rack and pinion is a simpler system, just it's fewer moving parts and fewer components. But because it comes with this cradle, it's easy to integrate into this system. Okay, is the original steering acceptable for a higher performance application? Probably. You know, there's things we need to do. The steering box needs to be overhauled, so we could go with a high ratio box. But we would still probably want to modify it a little bit, okay? It's already there, okay? And it's already, it works as the entire system in the cradle. And finally, front suspension geometry, okay? I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on this, but if we want to talk original, like I said in my last boring whiteboard video, the original suspension, not bad for its time. Okay. But do I really gain much by upgrading to the Z28 suspension? I do in two pretty important areas, okay? Okay, Z28 suspension has a better camber curve. And it's got better roll centers. In other words, it's got a more consistent, less variable roll center. Okay, so I do gain something by upgrading or changing the car to the Z28 suspension. I'm not going to get into the specifics about how that is here. Pretty quick, I'll do another whiteboard where we talk about what is a roll center, why are the camber curves important, things like that. By changing over to the Z28 front cradle and suspension, I get the benefits of less trouble with engine fitment. I get the air conditioning without having to make a bunch of modifications. I get a brake upgrade basically for free. I get a steering, you want to call it an upgrade, sure. I get that for free. And I get better front suspension geometry, all just by replacing the Firebird subframe, front subframe components with the Z28 subframe. Okay, I even bored myself with all that talk. In summary, I'm doing a lot of work. Am I really gaining things? I think so. And I think it's going to be worth it in the end. In retrospect, could I have done it an easier way? I think so. We'll talk about that when I'm done. But for now, I'll give you a sneak peek on where I'm at currently with the suspension swap. And as you can see, the subframes have been joined. I'm in the process of finishing all of that up, marrying them all together. And there's the other side of it. I'm working on the bottom right now. Just about done with that. So for the rest of this episode, we're going to delve into how I got to this point. And there was a plan A, this is plan B. So let's talk about plan A and why plan A didn't work and I switched over to plan B. Plan A of incorporating the Z28 cradle and suspension into the Firebird. Originally, I thought I might be able to just basically make some recessed pockets into the Firebird subframe. So I started off on that tack. Something was in the back of my mind the whole time though, and I'll tell you what, very quickly you're going to see me start to basically take a Sawzall to the subframe, and you go, what in the world is that guy doing? And oh my gosh, he's ruining that subframe. Well, I got to tell you, that subframe was tweaked. It was bent, and it was going to require some serious straightening if we ever were to reuse it, to the point where I think it might have been better off to get a whole new subframe if we were going to keep the original suspension. So don't feel too bad that I'm taking a Sawzall to that subframe, because it was in pretty bad shape. So here we go. Well, as the old saying goes, there's no going back now. First step in adapting the Z28 cradle, it's actually not the first step, it's about the 12th step of part 6 of adapting the Z28 cradle to the front subframe of the stock Firebird here, is I need to cut out the bottom and the sides here of the spring pocket in order to make room for the structure that the cradle is going to bolt to actually recess up into the frame itself. Okay, let me get these edges cleaned up, get the other side cut, and we'll stick the cradle back in, see where we're at. All right, let me catch you up on what's going on here. So, my first thought on adapting the engine cradles and suspension cradle for the Z28 didn't quite work out. The frame rails were not compatible enough for what I wanted to do. So I wound up just cutting off the forward portions of the frame rails. So here's the plan. What I've got is the frame rails from the Z28, including the shock tower temporarily. That's only here so that I can positively locate the upper control arm before I make my own shock towers. I am going to make my, strut towers. I am going to make my own towers. But I do need that for alignment purposes. And hopefully that will become clear as I go through this process. And the plan is I'm going to slowly shave my frame rails back on the original subframe, and I'm going to shave these frame rails forward until I get all my angles right and I get the positioning right. And then we will weld the two frame rails together, doubler plate everything, of course, for added strength. And just to give you a basic idea, that's how closely they match up. And I just wasn't getting that type of fit if I had left the inside portion of the original frame rail. So that's why I went this way. In the grand scheme of things, again, hopefully the method to my madness will become apparent as I go through this process. So what I've got to do now is get the suspension installed, and at that point I can start aligning and start raising the cradle up to where it needs to be, and then I can start also moving it back and get the final fitment for it. I've got to get the front suspension in the system, in the frame rails, intact enough that I can actually use it to take some valid measurements from ride height, everything, camber, caster, you name it. So one of the things I needed to do was I needed to put the upper control arms in, and I left the shock towers on the frame rails for now, just so I can help locate that. But another thing I need to do is get the upper control arms mounted, and in order to get the upper control arms mounted, I needed the, I forget what they call these things, the strut upper plates, maybe, something like that. I had to get those, but I can't leave the springs on the struts because then it makes it extremely difficult to articulate the suspension. So I had to take the springs off the struts. I didn't show that because I used the strut compressors death, and you know, every single time somebody uses these spring compressors, they die horribly, or they're maimed for life. Well, I got the springs off, both springs, and I only died twice, just a little bit. So with the springs off, I've got the struts available, or it should be the, here, let me show you, because I can't remember the name for these things. So there's the springs separated from the struts. Like I said, it was a very painless death twice. but I'm back. So what I needed was, I need these. All of this is going away except for the plates here for now, because we are going with coilovers. But like I said, I do need to have these in for now, just for locating the upper control arms. So let's put the front suspension together. So what we need to do is I need to take my old plate thingy here, slide it in, raise everything up to the point where everything slides up into my bracket here. Okay, so I've got the front suspension fairly close to what I think is going to be a good ride height, and I need to lock that in. So all I did, I've got some all thread. I'm going to and I drilled a hole up here in the shock tower. I'm going to drop that down in here. I'm going to go right through the sway bar mount, nut it on both sides. That'll help lock it in, and then I can final adjust for, I say final adjust, I can start getting the ballpark adjustment for the ride height that I want. So let me get this set up. I probably should have cut this first, but what the heck. Okay, so here we go. Let's see. I'll get some washers and a nut on the bottom. I'm hoping that hole down there is big enough for this. Boy, if there's a way to make this hard, I figured out how to do it. Leave myself a little bit of adjustability in here. That ought to work. And I can pull my jack out. We'll do the other side. I'll come right back. Alright, so I've got my all thread in to hold the suspension components up at an approximation of ride height. And ride height, although this is going to vary a little bit, what I'm going to do to start with is I'm going to set the tie rods at 0. Let's take a look, see here. So I'm at 0 right now on my level here. So let's work on this side. Okay, so I'm at 0.8 down. So let me spin my nut here. There's 0.6. Now I can lock the lower nut, and that should hold this right at 0. So let's go over to the other side and do the same thing. Here I'm at 0.1. Now I don't know if that's up or down, so let's find out. Yep, wrong way. Okay. We'll loosen this guy up a little bit. Alright, so where are we at here? We're at 0.1 down. And we got 0. Okay, so my tie rods are level. So let's take a quick look, see what we got. Okay, so we're going to try and do an eyeball on this and give you an idea of what I'm looking at here. So, and again, this is all just eyeball right now. So my tie rod is level. Okay, so as the suspension goes through its bumps, all right, in theory, both tie rods being level should minimize bump steer. And my lower control arm is angled down outboard just slightly. So I've got an angle that goes up to the other side of the car. Here, my upper control arm is angling down this way. So what I'll need to do is run an imaginary lines from either side, angling this way, to a point that'll give me a roll center somewhere out there. And again, I'll have to run the numbers on this, but this should be a fairly accurate beginning baseline for where the suspension should sit at ride height. Now that I've got the front suspension in a position that I can move forward, I've got to think about actually positioning the engine, transmission, and the cradle in the, or being able to get the engine, transmission, and cradle in a position where I can start manipulating the frame rails. And in order for that to happen, the engine needs to be at the proper height. But one of the things I've run across, as it is now, as you can see, I've just got the engine and transmission and cradle on a couple of dollies. They're just sitting on a couple of 2x8s, both on the front here and back at the transmission. And that was just for convenience purposes. But now, what I need to do I've got to really be able to move the engine cradle assembly in and out of position multiple times, but at the same time it actually needs to be in the position that it's supposed to be. So as you notice, everything is sitting very low. So I've got to raise the engine transmission up to about 13 inches at the bottom of the cradle. That's where my measurements were. And I've got to get the engine transmission at the proper height. And I've got to get the cradle at the proper height. So what I need to do is I need to build some kind of a mobile platform that's also adjustable. And here's my idea. So my idea was to take a couple of dollies, connect them together, that way I've got my mobile platform. Take some scissor jacks and stick them, two in the front, one in the back, to support the engine, transmission, and suspension cradle, and be able to raise it up. I could, move it any direction I wanted to go, and that would be that. Horrible. Well, okay, it might have been a good idea. My execution of it was awful. It was so wobbly in the end that it just flat didn't work. So if I'd used good quality jacks, maybe. I went out and got some really cheapos. Bad idea. Anyway, so at that point, reverted back to cinder blocks, 2x8s, and a bunch of wedges or door shims to get the cradle in the position it needed to be, and went from there. So I'll finish up today, and next week we'll press on with getting the engine cradle mounted into the subframe and into the Firebird. You know, at the end of the day, I'm just a guy in a garage having fun, making sparks, playing with a lot of really cool tools. From reading the comments, and I do read all the comments, I try and respond to as many as I can. It sounds that at least hopefully most of you guys are having fun following me on this quest to get this Firebird back on the road, and additional projects down the road as well when the time comes. I certainly do appreciate it. Thanks everybody for all the support. Please like, share, and subscribe. It really does help me out. Everybody, have a great day.